Before we start, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Keep that in your head, because in this story, time and place are everything. In the summer of 1894, a traveling revival tent rolled into the border between Indian Territory and Kansas with a promise that sounded harmless. The handbills said the river will wash what doctors cannot. People laughed at the wording until they did not. The tent had a bright white canvas, a painted sign that read, "Revival and Purity Cures," and a stage with a wooden immersion tub set into the floorboards. The couple who ran it called themselves Reverend Silas and Sister Miriam. They were married, well-spoken, and careful about manners. He kept a Bible and a ledger. She kept keys, a medicine case, and the women. You need to picture the first night the tent opened. Lanterns hung low. A mill owner from the next town had paid for the canvas and brought his workers on wagons. A county judge and the sheriff sat in the front row, not as participants, but as fixtures the crowd recognized. The sermon was short and heavy on words like clean, pure, and new birth. Then Sister Miriam stepped forward and announced separate hours for men and women, private examinations for those with weak nerves, and special river rites for brides, widows, and girls who had lost their way. She smiled when she said lost their way, as if she was offering them a map. People clapped. No one thought to ask who held the map or where it led. On the second night, Sister Miriam called a girl named Lottie from the crowd. 17, waitress at the railroad eating house, dark hair pulled tight because the owner required it. Miriam told the audience that Lottie had been troubled by fainting spells, shortness of breath, and a heaviness in the mind that the local doctor could not relieve. Lottie nodded. Her aunt, who raised her, sat 3 rows back with her hands clutched over a handbag. The aunt had visited Sister Miriam earlier that day during the women's hour and had left with a small vial marked calming tonic. 20 cents for the vial, a promise that a water rite would cure the rest. 3 more girls stood behind Lottie, shawls over their shoulders, looking at the tub as if it were a new piece of furniture they did not know how to use. Reverend Silas read a passage about washing away stains. He did not shout. He read evenly, like a clerk. Sister Miriam held a tin dipper. She said this in a voice trained to carry. There is a difference between the bath of the body and the cure of the spirit. To cure the spirit, you must name what has broken it, you must submit to examination, and you must trust the keeper of the water. The women in the tent looked at one another. Examination meant safety to some, humiliation to others, but the judge and sheriff in the front row gave the room a kind of permission. Later, several women said they felt relieved to see officials there. They did not know those officials had already visited the tent that afternoon. After the tent closed that night, the town still heard voices down by the river. Sister Miriam led the first group of women along the path to a bend screened by cottonwoods. The men were told to go home and pray. Lottie did not go home. She went with Sister Miriam because the aunt said she should, and because Sister Miriam spoke as if she had been a nurse in a proper hospital. The sheriff stood on the path a good distance back with a lantern lowered to keep the flame. He did not say anything. He watched the figures move down to the river and watched them return. He took down no names. 2 days later, Lottie did not show up to the eating house. Her aunt came to the tent to ask about her, and Sister Miriam said Lottie had been dispatched to a friend of the ministry in Winfield to rest. She used the word dispatched as if Lottie were a letter. She showed the aunt a folded sheet of paper, not for public reading, that referred to Lottie as a word of grace. The aunt did not understand the phrase, but recognized the judge's signature at the bottom. The signature was real. The judge had signed many such papers and called them temporary guardianships of a spiritual nature. The aunt could not read the fine writing that ceded decisions to the ministry for 30 days. She could see the gold seal. In the 3rd week, a woman named Jeanette, age 19, stood at the back of the tent with a friend and whispered about a rule that had spread quiet and fast. The rule said that during women's hours, no male doctor could be present. Sister Miriam used that rule to bar the town physician from entering. In his place, she allowed an older woman named Mrs. Pike, a midwife from Arkansas City, to assist with examinations. Mrs. Pike pulled a curtain across a wooden frame. Behind that curtain, she asked direct questions about bleeding, sex, and shame. She kept a list on a narrow-ruled tablet. No one saw her training. They saw only her apron and her sure hands. The first real pushback came from a schoolteacher named Emma, who took her younger sister Ruth to the tent because Ruth had fainting spells. Emma expected a prayer and a warm cloth. She did not expect Ruth to be told to remove her blouse behind the curtain. She did not expect Sister Miriam to say that disrobing was ordinary in medical climates. Emma told her sister to keep her blouse on. Sister Miriam then offered a private river rite instead. Emma said no. On the walk home, her sister called her harsh and said the cure was meant to erase a mistake Ruth had made with a boy behind the livery. The problem, Ruth said, was not the boy, but the heaviness afterward, the worry that something had begun inside her. Emma realized the tent was collecting secrets and converting them into power. During that same week, a traveling photographer set up outside the tent in daylight and offered cabinet cards with the name of the revival stamped on the back. Sister Miriam sometimes brought women to him for before and after portraits, fully clothed and posed like respectable school pictures. The photographer later told a grocer that Sister Miriam paid extra for copies without the ink stamp. He kept those aside in a separate envelope marked ministry. In several of those portraits, the young women hold a small Bible and a handkerchief and keep their eyes down. In at least one, the woman's hair is wet at the ends. By the 2nd month, the tent had a quiet agreement with the grain mill up the road. The mill owner provided wagons for evening river processions and free flour to widows who attended 3 services. In return, Reverend Silas praised the mill as a Christian enterprise and told men to bring their wives and daughters for proper counsel. A pattern formed. The tent arrived. The judge blessed it. The sheriff kept order. The doctor stayed outside unless invited. The mill provided wagons. Sister Miriam collected examinations and names. The ledger filled. A notebook of dispatch papers grew thick, and every few weeks 1 or 2 young women were sent away to rest. You will ask how the town allowed this. The answer begins with drought. In 1894, the river ran slow, and the wells turned iron. Men were desperate for anything that looked like favor. When Sister Miriam announced a special night of petition for rain, she asked for women to come forward and be cleansed so that the town would not be judged. It sounds theatrical when you read it now. In that tent, it sounded like a bargain with terms. Women stepped forward because they did not want to be seen as the reason their neighbors might suffer. If you have ever been in a small town, you understand how the fear of gossip can batter a person faster than the fear of a stranger's hands. The first documented complaint came from a druggist who noticed unusual purchases. In 1 week, Sister Miriam's assistant bought 3 bottles of laudanum, a jar of carbolic, and a stack of gauze. The assistant said they were for nervous ladies frightened of the river. The druggist asked the town physician about it in private. The physician said he had not written any orders. He tried to see inside the tent during women's hour and was stopped by Mrs. Pike at the curtain. He later found 2 faint chalk marks on the doctor's door that someone had rubbed off with a sleeve. He did not know they were signals used by the tent workers to time their sessions around his rounds. A widow named May visited the tent to ask about her niece, who had left with the ministry. May said the niece had written a postcard that sounded as if someone stood over her shoulder while she wrote it. It used phrases no 19-year-old used naturally. Things like "under sister's care" and "my new guardianship." May confronted Sister Miriam in the open, not behind the curtain. The crowd shifted. Reverend Silas appeared and thanked May for her concern and asked the sheriff to escort her outside for a private word. The sheriff did as asked. He told May the ministry had helped many families with problems too embarrassing for public talk. He asked May if she really wanted her niece's trouble printed in the newspaper. May said no. That was the end of it in the tent. It was not the end of it for May. At night, May stood near the cottonwoods and watched the path. She saw pairs of lanterns moving in a line. She saw a wagon wait at the bend for longer than a prayer would require. She heard a woman sob in the way that means the sob has gone on for a long time and no words are left to clothe it. May did not sleep. 2 nights later, she followed the wagon by foot and kept her distance. The wagon stopped at a low part of the river where men had dug a holding pit lined with planks for ice in winter. The pit was dry now. Sister Miriam brought 2 girls down the slope. She spoke to them in a voice May could not hear. She handed something to Mrs. Pike. The girls were led behind a screen. May saw shadows move like the angles of hands. She ran home before the wagon moved again. In the morning, May went to the newspaper office. The printer listened and then closed his door. He said he would lose half his advertisers if he printed what she told him. The judge would call it hysteria. The mill would pull its notices. The sheriff would stop bringing him public postings. The church ladies would stop paying for hymn sheets. He said he would need facts he could stack like bricks. Names, dates, receipts. May did not have those. She had shadows and a sound she could not forget. The first hint of those bricks came from an unlikely source. The photographer lost a small envelope behind his display case. It slid under the plank and stuck near a knot. He fished it out with a wire the next morning and found 3 unstamped prints of the same woman 6 weeks apart. In the first, she looks tired. In the second, her hair is wet, and she is thinner. In the third, she wears a plain, dark dress with the collar pinned high, her eyes fixed to the left, and Sister Miriam's hand rests just at the edge of the frame on the woman's shoulder. On the back of the last print, someone had written the word "cleared" in pencil. The photographer showed the prints to the printer. The printer told him to say nothing and put the envelope in a locked drawer. Now you need to see how the tent used paperwork as a fence. A farmer's wife named Celia signed a pledge to abstain from marital relations for 40 days at Sister Miriam's urging. The pledge had 2 parts. One was a vow, which looked like church material. The second was a consent for private inspection to ensure compliance. Celia could not read the second part well because the type was faint, but she signed because Sister Miriam acted like a person used to obtaining signatures in difficult moments. When the farmer grew impatient and tried to break the pledge, Sister Miriam brought the sheriff to warn him that any violation would place his wife under church discipline and legal guardianship for her safety. The sheriff did not quote any statute. He did not need to. The presence of his badge made the threat feel like law. The tent stayed for 3 months, left for 2 weeks, and came back for 6. Every return brought new women to the river, and a few more who did not come back to their beds. The ministry said those had gone on to opportunities with church families farther north. The letters that followed read as if copied from a form. The printer recognized the spacing. He recognized his own type. Someone was using his shop at night. He checked his sorts the next morning and found new wear on the numerals and the comma slugs. He kept that to himself and started writing dates in a small pocketbook. The turning point for Chapter 1 is simple enough to say. On August 17th, a thunderstorm finally broke over the river, and people cheered because the heat had been a lid on their lives. The tent was closed for repairs after the wind tore a seam. In the break, a girl named Ruth, the schoolteacher's sister, appeared at Emma's door before dawn, with her hair cropped short and bruises on both elbows, the kind you get from being held down on boards. She had a paper in her pocket that said, "Ward of Grace." She said she had been cured. Then she said she had been examined 4 times in one night and that the cure did not feel like a cure. She said she had been told not to tell because telling would take rain away from the town. Emma sat her down and wrote the date and the hour in ink. That was the moment this stopped being murmurs under canvas and became a case. Ruth's statement changed the posture of the few people who had been whispering. It gave them a clock time, a name, and the language the tent used. Emma took Ruth to the town physician first. He examined bruising on the elbows and the backs of the shoulders and wrote phrases that mattered in court, even if court never came. Circular contusions consistent with restraint. Lacerations consistent with recent manipulation. He did not guess at motives. He wrote what he could see. He handed Emma a copy and kept the original in a locked drawer marked with a red thread so he could tell if anyone opened it. He had learned to do that after a county deputy had once borrowed a file and returned it thin by 3 pages. The printer looked at Ruth's Ward of Grace paper and noticed the spacing again. He could tell which font family had been used without looking at the typecase. It was his 6-point Roman, not the church's usual 12-point. Someone had typed the forms on his small press at night when he left the shop to cool. He kept a habit of counting sorts in the morning. The commas and numerals did not lie. A sheet of his thin onion paper had gone missing from the back cabinet. He decided to make a simple test. He set the word grace in 6-point and put a deliberate nick in the serif of the letter R with the point of a penknife. Then he left his shop unlocked for the first time in 3 years and went home by the long road. At the telegraph office, an operator named Walt had his own reason to pay attention. He kept copies of money orders he transcribed for the tent because the receipts for Western Union sometimes jammed, and he had to rewrite them by hand. He did not consider himself a detective. He considered himself careful. When he lined the copies side by side, he noticed most were addressed to the same 3 destinations along the revival route, and many were made out in Sister Miriam's hand, but signed by different girls. 2 were signed by Lottie. The dates lined up with the nights after river rites. He told the agent from the railway company because the agent played poker with him on Saturdays and because the agent had no reason to be afraid of the judge. The agent shrugged and told him to keep the copies. Some trains carry grain. Some carry things with fewer questions. It was not a moral statement. It was a description of business. The photographer returned with his envelope and a nervous need to unburden. He placed the 3 unstamped prints on the printer's composing table, and then added 2 more he had been afraid to show. One of the new prints was a posed group of 4 women outside the tent in daylight. Sister Miriam stood behind them, hands resting lightly on shoulders. The other was taken in the shade near the river. The angle was poor, but a face could be seen in profile. The printer's lips tightened. It was the judge. He did not look at the camera. He looked past it, as if approving the use of film. The three men met that night after closing. The telegraph operator brought his copies of money orders. The photographer brought the prints. The printer brought the nicked letter R set into a single word strip clamped in a small chase. They agreed to gather without talking to the sheriff, not because they hated him, but because they understood that if he had already been used as a prop in the tent, he could not be trusted to act quickly. They also did not bring the physician because the physician still believed he could proceed through ordinary channels. Ordinary channels had allowed the tent to use legal words around private acts for 2 months. They needed a bridge between rumor and proof. They decided to go after paper. Reverend Silas did not carry the big ledger in public, but Sister Miriam always kept a smaller notebook at her hip, tied to a braided cord. She recorded donations, pledges, and names for the women's hours. If they could not get the ledger, they would try for the notebook. They did not plan a theft. They planned to ask for a receipt and to watch how she wrote it, what pocket she used, where she set the book down when she moved to the immersion tub. The printer could tell the difference between a person who writes from habit and a person who writes from memory. They chose May to be their eyes at the women's hour because she had already put herself at risk and because Sister Miriam underestimated her. May bought 2 vials of calming tonic and asked for a receipt so that her nephew could repay her. Sister Miriam smiled and wrote one without asking questions. May noticed that Sister Miriam wrote across the lapboard in tiny strokes, kept the pencil tucked behind the right ear, and used the left hand to control the notebook so no page exposed more than a thumb's width. When a cry rose behind the curtain, Sister Miriam passed the notebook to Mrs. Pike's apron pocket without looking. That was the moment May was waiting for. She dropped one of her vials under the bench, bent with a gasp, and stood again with a scrap of paper that had stuck to the glass from the dirt floor. She did not read it there. She put it into her glove. Back at the printer's shop, they lit the lamps and brushed the scrap clean. It was a half-page torn on the diagonal with 2 columns of numbers and surnames written in a careful hand. The left column had dates. The right column had figures beside last names and small letters that could be codes. Next to Lottie's last name, the figure 850 appeared with the letter R. Next to Ruth's, there was 5 euro and the letter E. The printer speculated about codes. R could be river. E could be examination. There were also small marks that looked like checks. The telegraph operator noticed that the dates matched his money order slips by 2 or 3 days. The printer took a soft pencil and ticked through the names to see which appeared on the tent's handbills as testimonials. Several did not. Those, he assumed, were the ones that left. The physician finally joined them after reading his copy of Ruth's note a second time and realizing that nothing in his drawers would move unless pushed. He did not like going outside procedure. He had fought for years to be treated as a man of science rather than a country sawbones. But he also knew how to measure a bruise and how long it took one to fade. He had a clock in his mind now, and it kept setting itself back to the hours Ruth mentioned. He brought them a fact that did not fit anywhere yet. In the last month, he had been called to certify 3 stillbirths on farms within the ministry circuit. He could not prove those pregnancies had passed through the tent first, but he could see that the husbands knew the tent workers by name. They needed one more piece to tie hands, paper, and money. They went to the mill, not as a group, not loudly. The printer visited the owner under the pretense of quoting a price for a broadside about new grain sacks. While the owner fetched a sample, the printer looked at the freight scale book open on the desk. On 3 dates, the mill had charged the ministry nothing for wagon use, and each of those nights matched women's hours on the tent's chalkboard. He did not steal the book. He copied the lines onto a scrap with his stub pencil. He told the owner he would draft the broadside and return in the morning. The owner smiled and said, "The Lord helps those who help themselves." It was, the printer thought, the first true sentence the man had spoken. The telegraph operator delivered the first clean line that could face a judge. He had caught his nicked R. 2 nights after the printer left his shop, unlocked an usher from the tent, walked into the telegraph office with a stack of ward papers to mail north. The usher asked to borrow the operator's blotter while he addressed the envelopes. When he left, one envelope had stuck under the blotter by a tack. The operator unfolded it carefully. The ward paper bore the word grace with a nicked serif on the R. The type could have come from no place but the printer's shop. The paper stock matched the onion paper the printer had said was missing. The date was last night. The name at the bottom was Lottie, written in a nervous hand, with an X where a signature should go, and a note by Sister Miriam that the ward could not sign due to the state of her nerves. The judge's signature sat below the note like a lid. They took their little pile of bricks to the one person who could align them without running to the sheriff. A county auditor named Raymond was in town to reconcile bridge funds and hated being here because every visit ended with a request to join a supper. He did not drink with officials. He kept his job by refusing favors loudly and often. The printer invited him to the back room with the door open so no one could say they had conspired. He laid the telegraph copies on the table, then the mill wagon entries, then the ward paper with the nicked R, then the half-page from the notebook. He did not mention the photographs until last. When he did, he slid the one with the judge's profile across the table and waited. Auditor Raymond did not hurry. He aligned the papers by date. He wrote a list that ran like a rail schedule. Money in, wagon out, women's hours, river, money out, dispatch. He circled repeating destinations and wrote beside them the names of ministers in those towns he had seen on other support letters. He looked at the ward paper closely and found a docket number that the judge's clerk should have written in a larger hand. It was the number for a probate matter from 2 years earlier involving a drowned boy. The auditor said one sentence that set the direction for the next move. If a signature travels on the wrong number, it is either clumsy or it is deliberate. He told them what to do next with the patience of a man who had peeled graft off books for a decade. You do not accuse a traveling ministry of false guardianships in print until you have the ledger that tells them what they fear to see reflected. He drew a square on the back of a handbill and labeled its corners Women, Money, Paper, Wagon. Then he set his pencil in the center and tapped. Ledger. He said the ledger proves commerce. Commerce proves motive. Motive drags a robe and a badge into daylight. Bring me the book Reverend Silas does not carry in public. Bring me a page with figures that match the telegraph slips and the mill book. Bring me one entry with the nicked R in a margin note. Bring me that, and I will go to the judge at his own desk and make him read his wrong number out loud. Then he shut the handbill and said he was going to bed. Then he said the line that none of them forgot. If you cannot open a locked book, make the man who owns it open it for you. They had a plan that did not require masks, crowbars, or a miracle. It required a crowd, a reason for Reverend Silas to perform legitimacy in front of his own people, and a path that forced his hand to touch the leather cover he kept hidden. Auditor Raymond's sentence was their spine. If you cannot open a locked book, make the man who owns it open it for you. They decided to build an errand the ministry could not refuse and stage it at the hour when the tent did its best theater, the river rites. Emma took the part that required a straight face and a steady voice. She wrote a formal letter on the newspaper's letterhead to Reverend Silas, offering the paper's platform for a public response to the wave of rumors. The letter praised the ministry's charity statistics that Silas liked to quote. It asked for a single verifiable figure to print alongside his statement so readers would not accuse the tent of hiding its good works. It named that figure as the total relief paid out to widows and wards in Whitfield County since the tent's arrival, and it said the paper would send a reporter to copy the number directly from the ministry ledger to avoid any transcription errors. She added a line that would catch Sister Miriam's eye. If the ledger is traveling with the tent this week, our reporter can take the number tonight by the river, so your workers are not inconvenienced. Emma signed it and sent Walt the telegraph operator to deliver it so there would be a record of time and receipt. The printer drafted a broadside that would make the tent greedy to answer. It was not an accusation. It was bait. Black type across the top read, "How the Revival Feeds Our Neighbors." Below it were 4 empty boxes labeled numbers to be provided by the ministry. Widows helped, orphans housed, meals served, relief issued. He ran 50 copies and had the boys he trusted hang them near the livery, the mill, and the telegraph office. He made sure one sat under the nose of the judge's clerk on the courthouse steps. The broadside did 2 things at once. It flattered the ministry's need to be counted as a pillar, and it promised a public square where silence would look like guilt. May rehearsed a second piece of the errand with the physician because it needed to be spoken exactly. She would present herself as the representative for 5 women who had taken the revival's word of grace in good faith and were now applying for poorhouse vouchers. The vouchers required proof that other available relief sources had been approached. The ministry pamphlet listed a widows and wards fund. The county would accept a note from Reverend Silas attesting to the women's ineligibility only if the note cited the ledgers by page. The physician did not want to put his name anywhere near the tent's bookkeeping, but he saw the utility of county phrases. He wrote May a short script on his prescription pad using that language. May memorized it like a catechism. Auditor Raymond wrote a brief note of his own and tucked it into his pocket. He did not intend to show it unless the moment appeared. It was a polite request for the ministry's annual filing under the Traveling Benevolence Statute, signed in his hand. It had no force of law without a witness and a clock, but it wore the weight of the county seal at the top. He pinned his watch to his vest and told the printer he would stand at the back of the crowd and wait for a specific cue. When Reverend Silas opened a book, any book, Raymond would step forward and ask if the number on the page could be read into the record for the broadside. If Silas refused, every person by the river would see it. If he agreed, they would have a number that could be matched against money orders and wagon entries. If the number came from the small notebook at Sister Miriam's hip, Raymond would ask for the authoritative volume, the ledger, as the statute required. They also needed a way to ensure Sister Miriam did not leave her notebook in a trunk. The photographer supplied a solution from simple stagecraft. He would ask in front of the congregation and the judges of rural opinion if he could take a photograph of Reverend Silas with the book that kept the measures of their mercy, to hang inside the tent as a testimony to honest works. Silas liked cameras when they blessed him. Cameras also made men hold props. The photographer oiled his shutter and prepared a plate holder wrapped in cloth so it would look ceremonious when he bowed. All of this would fail if Reverend Silas smelled coordination. They insulated each part. Emma's letter was delivered by Walt at noon, hours before the river rite, and it contained no hint that anyone else would be involved. The broadside hung without Emma's name on it and simply promised numbers soon. May visited the tent in the afternoon and asked Sister Miriam about the widow's vouchers using the physician's language while pretending to be slow to understand. Sister Miriam smiled with patient superiority and said, "Sister dear, we will help you, but that sort of writing is for the evening hours when we settle accounts. Return at dusk, and you will leave with paper." Walt also sent a second unrelated telegram at 3 p.m. to a railway agent in another town, the same agent who had been politically indifferent earlier. The content was ordinary. The timing was not. It made the tent believe the telegraph office had a business day like any other. Dusk brought weather that would help them. A bright sky from a dry front pulled the town down toward the river, the way a fresh snowfall pulls children to their sleds. Music leaked from the tent in a practiced shimmer. Reverend Silas moved through the crowd with open arms, touching elbows, saying names, absorbing praise. Sister Miriam directed women to benches and into lines with her hand on the lapboard. The judge stood near the tree line with 2 merchants and pretended to be there for the hymn rather than for the heat of whisper and compliance that swirled around the water. Emma did not put a reporter's notebook in her hand because she did not want anyone to think she was there to take a deposition. She brought only a folded copy of her letter, a pencil, and a straight back. She introduced herself cautiously, said she wanted to print the ministry's answer to ugly talk, and asked when she might copy the simple number the letter had requested. Reverend Silas smiled in the way he had learned calms a room and elevates himself. He said, "Of course, and since we are among friends, and since the Lord hates confusion, let us set down that number here and now." He turned to Sister Miriam and said, "Sister, bring me the book." Sister Miriam did not move. She hated being told to bring him anything when eyes were on her. She also understood theater. She produced her small notebook first to buy time, then saw the photographer rise with his wooden box. He asked the question they had written for him. Could he take a picture of men and book for the tent? Reverend Silas did not look at her notebook. He lifted his hands to shape the evening and said, "Friends, there has been much talk about figures and few about faith. Let us show both." He told an usher to fetch the ledger from the lockbox in the wagon and to bring it with the key. The word ledger traveled like a warm wind through the first rows. People who did not know what a ledger was knew from his tone that it was a sign of seriousness. The usher returned with a wooden case banded in brass. Sister Miriam kept her eyes on May, as if to see whether the poorhouse script was truly memorized. The usher placed the case on a small table beside the immersion tub. Reverend Silas unlocked it and lifted out a book bound in dull calf. The photographer's hands trembled enough to make him angry at himself. The physician, watching from the edge of the women's line, shifted to give May room. Auditor Raymond slid 2 steps toward the table and then stopped. He wanted the book opened in a way that put a page, any page, into the light. He did not care which heading appeared first. He cared that the book existed and that men saw its weight. Reverend Silas placed the ledger on the table, raised one hand, and preached a miniature sermon about how numbers blindly applied could never hold a life, and how the ministry kept them anyway because the county liked paper. He let the congregation laugh. Humor softened suspicion. Then, with a flourish meant to play to the photographer, he opened the book near its middle. Auditor Raymond moved. He did not rush. He stepped into the small space that had to be created when Silas turned his body to face the crowd and held up an index finger that meant politeness. He asked the question that gave their scheme backbone. "Reverend, for the sake of accuracy, will you read the total relief issued to widows and wards in this county since your arrival?" Silas did not flinch. He put a fingertip to a column and dragged it down in a way that said he recognized the territory. He read a number. It was large enough to sound impressive and small enough to be plausible. Emma kept her face neutral and repeated the figure back. Auditor Raymond nodded for the photographer to do his job. The photographer lifted the camera, set it on the tripod he had already planted, and asked Silas to hold the ledger toward the lens for a moment so everyone could see why the number could be trusted. That was the first time Sister Miriam lost composure. She moved to adjust the book with both hands, not because she liked to help, but because she liked to control the angle of exposure. In the process, she revealed the left margin of the open page, where a small note had been pressed under the leather strap to keep it from flapping. The printer, who had drifted forward on the pretense of seeking a better view, saw the shape of the note and swallowed. It was a scrap of thin onion paper with a tiny type impression in the word grace. If the serif on the R had a nick, they had the glue to stick every other piece to it. May delivered her roll as if she had not seen the scrap. She stepped into the space where women petitioners stood and spoke her memorized poorhouse language. "Sister, I need the ministry to either issue relief this evening to 5 names or write their ineligibility note with page citation so the county can act at sunrise." She named the 5 names. She did not include Lottie. She included Ruth. This was deliberate. It turned the ledger from a prop into a working tool in front of eyes. It also forced Sister Miriam to put pencil to paper and produce something traceable, either in the ledger itself or on a separate note. Reverend Silas felt the trap as a pressure in the chest rather than a thought, which is how practiced men feel risk. He could not refuse without making the broadside label for relief issued look like an empty boast. He could not grant money on the spot without looking improvident before donors. He decided to perform procedure. He asked Sister Miriam for the small notebook to record the 5 names and told her to enter them in the ledger after the baptisms when the totals would be updated. Auditor Raymond waited to be sure there would be a transfer from notebook to ledger in the hearing of witnesses. Then he reached deeper into his vest pocket, found the county note he had prepared, and decided he would not use it yet. He had something better in reach. The photographer lowered the camera to change plates and made a show of stepping closer. He spoke to the preacher in a way that sounded like flattery. "Reverend, could you tilt the book a hair more toward the light, just so the column heading shows?" Silas complied without looking at which column his fingertip now traced. The printer leaned an inch and read silent text from 3 inches away. Receipts, disbursements, wards of grace. Under disbursements, a line item carried the abbreviation R and a figure that matched the most recent telegraph slip within pennies. On the margin, pinned by the strap, the word grace showed the nick in the serif. The printer did not speak. He counted to 3 the way Raymond had taught him to do in a shop when facts arrived. May watched Sister Miriam's hand work across the lapboard. Something happened then that none of them had planned, but that gave them a cleaner nail than anything they had constructed. A young usher ran up carrying a fresh envelope for the evening's railroad dispatches. He handed it to Sister Miriam and said, "This one is for the judge, like always." He said it without thinking and with the friendliness of a boy who wanted to do a job well. He said it in front of the photographer, the printer, the physician, Emma, Auditor Raymond, the judge's clerk, and 3 farmers who disliked the judge's taxes but loved his ability to settle boundary fights. Auditor Raymond did not raise his voice. He asked the usher to repeat whom the envelope was for and then to hand it to him for a moment so the address could be copied onto the broadside for transparency. The usher, confused but willing, passed it. The front carried the judge's name and a docket number that did not match the one on the ward paper Walt had found under the blotter. It matched a far older property case from a different township. The back carried a wax wafer that had not yet been pressed. In the top left corner, too faint for anyone except a man who lived in ink to notice, was the impression of a single nicked serif, where a tiny scrap had dented the paper before it was torn free. The judge saw the heads turn and folded his arms to make his chest look solid. He did not move toward them. He let the crowd's noise rise and fall until the hymn leader tried to save the moment by calling for a song. Reverend Silas understood that the air had shifted. He did what he always did when air shifted. He tried to pour words over it. He said the letter was a routine report about bridge funds the ministry would help collect, nothing to do with wards or relief. Auditor Raymond asked pleasantly why a private ministry would be routing a county bridge report through the judge at the river on a night marked for widows and wards. Sister Miriam saw something she had not respected enough 5 minutes earlier. She saw that she could not keep both notebooks invisible at the same time. 2 men of paper and a woman with a prescription pad had triangulated her. She reached to remove the margin scrap under the ledger strap. The photographer raised his camera and said, "Reverend, hold that just as it is for the picture so we do not blur the truth." Reverend Silas held it exactly as it was. Sister Miriam's hand stopped in midair. Emma did not improvise often, but she understood a live room. She took 1 step toward the table and spoke calmly so that even the judge could not accuse her of shouting a lie. "Reverend, for the sake of those who gave and those who received, would you please read the heading at the top of the page you are holding, and the date at the bottom?" She knew those were the 2 least self-incriminating lines a man could read from a ledger in public and still hang himself if the book did not say what the tense mouth had promised. Silas looked down to perform compliance and saw that he could not change the ink already written. He read the heading and the date slowly, and the nail seated because the heading was Wards of Grace, disbursements, and the date matched the money orders and the mill's free wagons exactly. Reverend Silas finished reading the heading and the date, and for a full breath no one moved. The hymn leader's hand stayed in the air and then dropped. The judge tried to regain the ground by acting offended on behalf of order. He told Raymond that county business did not belong at a river service, and told Emma that printing numbers out of context would harm charity. He stepped forward to take the envelope back from Raymond as if he were retrieving his hat from a friend. Raymond did not resist. He handed it over calmly and then asked in the same volume for Sister Miriam to state for the crowd whether the 5 names May had presented would be entered tonight in the ledger or denied with page citation as the poorhouse required. That was the pivot. Sister Miriam had to choose a line and put her voice on it. She tried to split the difference. She said the ministry would be happy to help after the baptisms, because the figures had to be reconciled, and the judge would not want to be kept waiting. She reached for the ledger strap with her left hand in a motion meant to look routine, and with her right she slid the margin scrap toward the edge of the page. The photographer said, still and clear, "Do not move," and triggered the shutter. The plate holder clicked home with the sound of a nail tapped once into soft wood. The image would show the heading, the date, the strap, and the scrap's torn edge. The usher who had carried the case stepped between Sister Miriam and the table as if to help, but his eyes were on the judge. The judge gave him a small nod that said, "Close it and bring it." The usher put a hand on the cover. The printer, who looked like a man leaning forward to read the line of a hymn, set his palm on the ledger's backboard and said, soft enough to seem polite, "Not before the names are entered." The usher froze. The crowd split into two rings, those who loved the tense certainty and those who loved seeing certainty forced to show work. No one in the front row wanted to be the first to shove. People turned not to the judge and not to Silas, but to a third center, the physician, because he held the town's quiet trust. The physician did what good doctors do when the room is about to shake. He made a simple demand in practical words. He said the ledger was now part of a public assistance determination, and no man here would keep the poorhouse from its proof without signing his name to that refusal in front of witnesses. The judge stepped into that sentence and claimed it as an insult to his office. He said the ledger belonged to a church, not the county, and that the ministry's generosity did not answer to any statute. Raymond raised the one paper he had not used and let the seal show in the fading light. He said he was not seizing anything. He was requesting inspection under the traveling benevolence statute that the ministry had used to solicit free wagons from the mill. If the judge insisted the statute did not apply, then the wagons had been misappropriated, and the mill would be notified in the morning. He said those words slowly enough for the mill foreman, standing in the third row, to hear them in full. Silas read the foreman's face and saw his margin vanish. He tried a new angle. He told Sister Miriam to copy the 5 names to a slip immediately, and to mark them paid from tonight's offering as a gesture of unity. It was a quick calculation. Buy a moment, close the book, walk away with the ledger, and fight in print tomorrow. May did not let the gesture pass as healing. In the exact language the physician had taught her, she asked for the page and line citation to accompany the slip because the county auditor would require it. She held out the physician's prescription pad like a deputy badge. Sister Miriam stared at the paper and then at the ledger as if pages might rearrange themselves to rescue her. The photographer carried the plate holder to the cloth bag and slid a second glass into the camera. He did not need a second image, but he wanted the tent to believe he did. The printer kept his hand on the ledger. The mill foreman said, loud enough for men behind him, that free wagons were for grain and church roofs, not for private mail to the judge. The judge's clerk, who had come for a show and found a record, looked sick. Sister Miriam made her choice. She wrote the 5 names on a slip and signed them paid tonight from the ward fund, and under her breath added a page number she knew was wrong. She tore the slip and looked up in triumph at having produced paper. Raymond asked to see it, read the false citation, and handed it to Emma without comment so she could copy it in her notebook. Then he asked Reverend Silas to read, from the open page he still held, the correct page number for Wards of Grace disbursements for this quarter. Silas hesitated 1 beat too long. The photographer said hold, and the shutter clicked again, catching the minister's finger not on any number, but in the white space where the torn scrap had been. The judge snapped. He reached over the table to close the ledger himself. The printer did not fight him, but he did not remove his hand. He said, "One more line, Reverend. Read the line that mentions the letter to the judge." It was a bluff. The ledger did not have that line. It had abbreviations and sums. But the printer had watched Sister Miriam pin notes under the strap. He knew the ledger owned its margins as much as its columns. The bluff worked like a hook. Silas jerked the cover closed to hide what was not there, and the cover bit the scrap and pulled it free. The small slip of onion paper fluttered from the strap to the wetboards like a fish. The physician stepped on it out of reflex and then bent to pick it up with 2 fingers as if he were lifting a splinter from a thumb. He handed it to Emma. The nicked serif in the word grace matched the money orders, the telegraph slips, and the dent on the judge's envelope. The judge told the usher to take the ledger and go. The usher lifted the book. The mill foreman stepped into his path and did not touch him, only stood there with both feet planted and his arms at his sides. Behind him, 2 men from the spur line moved the same way. People do not often face down a judge. They face down boys with boxes when those boys look like couriers of something that has stolen from their dinner table. The usher looked at Reverend Silas. Silas looked at the judge. The judge weighed whether he wanted to be the man who started a wrestling match with farmers over a church book at the river, and saw the end of that story before it began. Raymond ended it for him. He said no one was seizing anything. The ledger could return to the case with the lock, but the ministry would provide, before the tent rolled, a certified copy of the page that had been read, with the heading, date, page number, and the totals for wards of grace disbursements for the quarter. And the ministry would initial the margin where the strap had left its mark, so any later visitor could tell whether pages had been replaced. He said a failure to provide that copy by noon tomorrow would be published beside the broadside boxes and would be carried by telegram to the railroad agent and the mill owners who had given wagons on the understanding that the statute applied. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten prison. He promised daylight. Reverend Silas tried one last argument. He said the newspaper had been hostile. The auditor had overstepped, and the moment had turned into a circus that mocked faith. The hymn leader, trying to save the tent's dignity, began a verse alone. No one joined him. People were still looking at Emma's hands. She held the scrap flat between 2 pages of her notebook so the ink would not smear. She asked a simple question that made people sort themselves. She asked who here saw the letter to the judge fall from the ledger strap, and the Reverend read the heading and date from the very page it pinned. A dozen hands went up, then more. The judge looked across faces he would see again on jury lists and at polling places, and decided to step back a pace and search for another day to pull his weight. They did not get to keep the ledger. They did not need to. The photographer had the plate with the heading and the date and the strap mark. Emma had the number and the false citation and the scrap with the nicked serif. The printer had the broadside with 4 boxes ready for ink. May had a paid slip for 5 women that could not be walked back without admitting fraud. The physician had a clean sentence for the county commissioners to read aloud. Raymond had a long morning ahead of him. The tent did baptisms that night, but they were short and without theater. No one fell into the water the wrong way, which is how such nights usually end when tempers lose their shape. People left the river in smaller conversations than they had used to arrive. A woman Emma did not know pressed her hand and whispered that she had a card from a man in the judge's office who promised her place for a favor and asked what to do with it. The photographer packed his gear without looking up because he did not want his face to reveal how badly he wanted to run to the darkroom. By noon the next day, two things had happened. The ministry sent a copy of the ledger page with the heading, "Date and Totals," initialed at the margin, and the total did not match the telegraph sums or the money orders by a wide enough gap to make even friends frown. And Walt at the telegraph office handed Emma a single reply from the out-of-town rail agent who had ignored everyone all week. It was one line, the kind that arrives after a night of new instructions. He wrote that the agent would honor any lawful request for shipping records if accompanied by a county auditor's note and a notice printed in the paper for the sake of the subscribers who feared fraud. Raymond read it and nodded because he had his lawful note, and Emma had a front page. The tent broke camp at dusk under eyes that felt different from adoration and different from hatred. Sister Miriam kept her lapboard close and would not meet May's gaze. Reverend Silas held prayers that sounded like closing arguments. The judge rode out of town before supper and sent a boy back with a message that he would be in chambers for any man who wanted to talk sense. No one followed the wagon. They watched it roll, and the printer posted the broadside with the boxes filled and the initials in the corner, and people stopped to read instead of turning their heads. They did not take a victory picture. They did not toast. Emma wrote the story with a straight spine and stuck to what had been read and what had been seen, and who had raised a hand when asked. Raymond filed his formal inspection request with the state because the statute allowed it if local officials were compromised, and he used the word compromised without italics or heat. May went to Ruth's house with the paid slip and 3 names for honest work that would start next week, whether the tent returned or not. The physician wrote the poorhouse vouchers anyway, so no clerk could play games with women who had already been shoved enough. That night the photographer pulled the plate from the wash and held it up to the window. The heading, the date, the strap mark, and the missing scrap sat there in silver like the simplest sentence a town had ever needed. He dried it, slid it into a sleeve, and walked it to Emma without a word because the picture did not argue. It showed. When she set it next to the scrap in her notebook, the nicked serif lined up with the dent in the judge's envelope as neatly as a nail finding the pilot hole someone else had drilled years before.